Welcome to the Psychedelic Passage podcast. My name is Jimmy Nguyen. I'm joined here by my co-host and co-founder of Psychedelic Passage, Nick Levitch. We have a guest here with us to talk about Colorado Prop 122, Mr. Josh Kappel, who is a founding partner of Vicente Cederberg with a practice devoted to helping entrepreneurs and like-minded professionals build human-centric and regenerative companies in the cannabis and psychedelic communities. Josh also has a passion for helping advocates draft legislation and build sustaining vehicles that will forever influence these emerging industries. Recently, Mr. Kappel was a co-author and chair of the campaign committee for Colorado's Prop 122, which we'll be discussing today, which was the first successful state ballot measure to create access to natural psychedelic healing through both a state-regulated model and a decentralized community healing model. Josh was also a drafter of Denver's psilocybin decriminalization initiative and has assisted in drafting cannabis and psychedelic measures across the country for over 12 years. So thanks for joining us, Josh. Really, really great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. It's an honor to be on the podcast.
Yeah, and on our last episode, we focused on the community healing model, the decriminalization surrounding personal use. And I think that today I'd like to focus our dialogue around the regulatory frameworks around support services with psychedelics and what that means for facilitators, therapists, harm reduction specialists, service providers. So really excited to dive in with you.
I think the best way to look at the regulated model is this is the model designed, for the public that doesn't have access to natural psychedelics on their own. That's not part of, a psychedelic-based community. And so, my big picture sort of view on the world, which may change, but is that I support an all-pass model forward on access to psychedelic healing. I think as we talked about last week, there's this key personal agency, personal use model. There's a community use model. And this is sort of this model is hey, this is the public facing model of a state regulated system that's not medicalized. There is another model, the federal medicalized model, that requires a diagnosis, but this one doesn't. And I think it's important to sort of think about this as a state regulated model, that's can be really for for therapeutic or other reasons.
That makes sense, because that's a big part on why we exist at Psychedelic Passage, knowing that there are many people who are interested in using psychedelics for some type of intentional use or healing or processing. And they're not plugged into a spiritual community or a psychedelic church or a psychedelic community, whereas there are many folks in Colorado who are. And so I really appreciate that distinction. And to my understanding, this does create some type of a regulatory framework and licensure for people to provide these services. And so can you talk through the roadmap for that? What does that look like? What are the milestones? When does this all kick in?
Right. So, it's unlike, the personal use section, which kicks in, pretty much today, depending on how you read the retroactivity. This measure, or the regulated access program, is supposed to be developed over the next 2 years, with input from the community and with input from stakeholders. And, and it is also, it's a statutory measure too. So it could be, tweaked by the legislature as well. And, the first major step is, there's an advisory board that's, that should be appointed by the governor by the end of January, with applications for the advisory board closing at the end of December. And, in the advisory board, there's, specific expertise that's required on the advisory board, but there's not really any saved seats. It's one person could hold, could hold any of the expertise. With that said, there is actually the only saved seat that's on the advisory board is for someone, with the experience in the indigenous use of natural medicines. The So that's key. The advisory board will, you know, once they're set up, will likely, if we look at what's happening in Oregon and what we saw in other state regulated industries in Colorado, we'll really be tasked with like making recommendations around all the rules related to this program. And there'll be, likely be different listening sessions. Maybe there's subgroups. There'll be a lot of time for the public to provide comments. And so the idea is, that the advisory board will make recommendations, that then would be accepted by DORA, which is the Department of Regulatory Affairs, which is the main regulatory agency under, the main agency tasked with regulating the regulated access program. And so as we, go on and talk about like what sort of rules and what this could look like, it's important to remember, there will be, a public input process. There's an advisory board that makes recommendations to the regulators. What we've seen in the past, especially around programs like this that are so new where the regulators don't have experience with it, is that they will most likely lean on the advisory board and adopt their recommendations. Maybe there's a couple tweaks here, but it's, for a regulator who has no experience with psychedelics to ignore the advice of an advisory board will be
Well, I hope that some of those regulators will take advantage of the personal use side, and maybe they get an opportunity to explore psychedelics within their community as they are forming these regulations. That's maybe too idealistic for me. I don't know, but there's a pathway for it. But what I hear you say is that the ability to go to a state regulated licensed service provider for any type of psychedelic support or harm reduction is likely not going to be available until 2024 is probably the case.
Correct. And so all the rules are supposed to be done by September 2024, with applications open at that point for healing centers and
Oh, so
facilities.
really 2025 then, because there will have to be an application process, there will have to be an approval process, a training process, doing all the things to receive the license. You got to then open up your, facility or healing center. So we're actually really talking about 2025 here for this regulated model.
Right. And then, I think another key piece on another key piece on, on the timeline, is there is like January 21 or January 1st, 2024. So like a year and 2 weeks from now, it's like the state's supposed to start approving facilitator training programs, so for those, which isn't a lot of time, but that is, things are supposed to move a little bit sooner. And another key date is June 2026, which is like where the state could add other natural psychedelic medicines in this measure to the regulated program.
Right, because right now it's just psilocybin services, but there is an option for ayahuasca, DMT, mescaline that's not derived from peyote, ibogaine, iboga. So there's potential for a regulated model around those too.
Right. And I think there's, and I'm not convinced that like all those substances should be in a regulated model. To me, it's like, like I think there's pros and cons of like if something's in a regulated model or not. And do we really want ayahuasca in a regulated model, or is that better in the community healing model? I think benefits of a regulated model is, is people can get insurance, you can be public about it, you can have safety protocols, but then you also have state oversight of something that maybe the state shouldn't have oversight over. But things like ibogaine, provided we can figure out the sustainability issues, the cultural issues, like a lot of underlying issues with it, would actually be better in a regulated model, because then you can mandate certain health screenings, and and that would actually be more beneficial there. So it's each substance I think has to be looked at differently.
So I have a question, because I'm in Oregon, you guys are in Colorado. The rollout of Measure 109 has been challenging at best, and it's still like there's just a lot of uncertainty. And so I'm curious, maybe for your perspective on how Prop 122 is maybe the same and or different to Measure 109.
Yeah, no, so great question. I think on the regulated side, you see a lot more similarities with Oregon's 109. A lot of those similarities are, there's a mandated preparation session, and there's a mandated, supervised administrative session. There's a mandated integration session. And many people say there should be like 100 mandated integration sessions, but topic for another day. So like that piece is very similar. There's a state licensing model for healing centers. There's a state licensing model for facilitators. But there is a number of differences too. The main one being like this whole personal use model that we talked about last time, and also this idea of like adding different substances in. But really where the differences get really interesting is like in the details. And so a big piece of, or not a big piece, but like one aspect of Colorado's model is it allows for these sessions, for these natural medicine, services to be provided at a private residence or another healthcare facility. And so what that actually looks like is really up to this like regulatory process. And is there going to be 2 facilitators required at a private residences? Can you have group sessions at a private residence? Can you only have it at a private residence if you're bedridden? Like all these different questions, like, sort of come up, and, that will be really interesting to unpack. And I think it'll also be interesting to unpack, like, hey, how are these services going to take place at healthcare facilities, at addiction treatment centers, and nursing homes? And this is like a big difference, in the model, is sort of like not requiring these services just to be at healing centers.
Mm-hmm. Who's I say this very loosely to our audience, by the way, but who's qualified or allowed to apply for these licenses? The one thing that I like in Prop 122, I like a couple things, and there's a couple things that I'm of course have a healthy debate about, but one thing that I like is that there's some language that says that there's a previous licensure is not required, and the way that I read that is that you don't have to be, let's say, a licensed therapist already, or a licensed social worker or a counselor already, to be able to apply for a license to operate a psilocybin assisted services center. So can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so like there's 2 licensing, there's 2 licensing regimes, I guess, that are created under under Prop 122. One is the licensing of facilitators, and who qualifies to be a facilitator, and the other one's the licensing of healing centers. And I think each we should talk about in turn. And the facilitator license, how it's structured right now is that it'll be, right next to all the other professions that DORA regulates, whether it's the therapist or or the nurse or the doctor, will be the facilitator. And, and they're required to sort of develop, the training programs of like, what does it mean to, to obtain a facilitator license? And a lot of the details will ultimately like come out through this regulatory process, but we did mandate a couple things. We mandated sort of a tiered training program, what services the facilitator is providing, and the indications of the participants. So the idea here is like, how do we create like a stackable, equity-based, like career pathway that allows people, to come in, with like, so that's not like unreasonably difficult for someone to become a facilitator, and allows them to like grow with their experience. And so the idea, is if someone's, being a trip setter or being a guide, that's different than, if, and they're just holding space, that's going to be different than if someone's providing psychedelic assisted therapy. And it's different if someone's coming in for a spiritual experiences versus like coming in for trauma, and there's, and a lot of times the difficulty is gonna be like, how do we differentiate, and how do a lot of people don't, haven't even like recognized some of the trauma that they have. But so the idea is like, hey, maybe there's like a facilitator 1, and then a facilitator 2 license, a facilitator 3 license, and you can, through experience, you can move up from a facilitator 1 to a facilitator 2, etc. so you can create sort of like a pathway where people are actually like have hands-on experience, and can progress, just based off of doing the work. With that said, though, you're right that there's no prerequisite requirements for this isn't limited to just psychotherapists or psychiatrists. It's really anyone, can go through this facilitator training program. And the and the state's supposed to take into consideration, prior experience, though, whether it's prior experience as a therapist or prior experience with these natural medicines actually calls it out. So like I think that's a key piece of of the facilitator licensing is, it's like this is sort of like how we intended it, but when through this community process, I think we'll see a lot of changes and tweaks, and what is the difference between a facilitator that's providing non-directive services versus therapy related services, and what should those requirements look like? Is this a 300-hour program? Is this a 1,000-hour program? There's a lot of questions there. And I will say one key piece of this, though, there's a mandate, around how do we, make sure we have equity in the facilitator training program, and that's, both in terms of like the cost, like not having it like unreasonably like financially prohibitive, but also, there's a mandate from the state to create equitable programs. And I don't know if that's going to turn into subsidies, if it's going to turn into grants, or if it's going to turn into different requirements, or, like a lot of that, piece around equity on the facilitator license side, like still needs to be fleshed out and created.
Well, I have to say, from my perspective, it sounds like you thought through a lot of the shortcomings that were associated with the rollout here in Oregon, because one of the bugaboos that I have is everything in Oregon is considered psychedelic assisted therapy, but there's no tiered programs to rank facilitators, and there's also no requirement of you to have any sort of therapeutic or therapy training. And so I keep thinking of this situation where, a journeyer's got schizophrenia and they get paired with someone with a high school diploma who completed 200 hours of education and is now a licensed facilitator. And that's always just felt like a mismatch to me. And what I'm hearing you say is the tiered program helps qualify which facilitators are actually suited to work with, certain types of journeyers, depending on what they're seeking.
And you're right, and that's sort of like the ideal dream of it. We'll see how it like plays out in practice, and it's like and a lot of this, it's like I think what was so messy in Oregon was they're the first people to do that. We can learn from some of their mistakes, and us pivoting based off of some of their mistakes will likely lead to new mistakes. And that's just going to be part of this process.
Yeah, it's not black and white. It's a double-edged sword, especially with like the prerequisites to this. On one hand, it allows for anybody who has, who eats 1 gram of psilocybin to be like, this is my destiny. I'm here to like help and support people and all of that. And so you get a lot of people off the street who may not have the natural skill set or capacity to hold this space. So that's maybe a tricky part of this. And then on the other side, it does open up some doors for folks of all different types of backgrounds, whether it's indigenous lineages to spiritual religious backgrounds to formal mental health, backgrounds to, peer support backgrounds, folks who work in the harm reduction, world, to also have a shot at this. And so I totally hear that it's there's a lot in between those two ends of the spectrum, and also there's a whole implementation standpoint as well. So it'll be interesting to see how it unfolds. And you mentioned that there's another, I guess, tranche for healing centers, or a different like set of licensure for healing centers, right?
Right. No, yes. So it's like we have our facilitator license, and facilitators don't have to be linked to a healing center. Like, you can create your own sort of like facilitator network, there's, different items there. But then you have the healing centers. And so the healing centers is sort of our one size fits all sort of like business entity in the space, and they're, technically, allowed to cultivate and process and sell products to each other, and also provide these also like be a place for like the provision of natural medicine services. And this is the piece I sort of alluded to in our last session around, hey, how do we like understand that like companies do provide, like they do actually provide a lot of benefit to the world, but how do we limit the harms of capitalism, and what sort of like pieces and restrictions are put in place there? And so this is a spot that's a little bit different than Oregon too, on really on 4 different pieces. One is we don't have any sort of like local opt-out, so like local governments can't ban healing centers from operating in their jurisdiction. They can create zoning regulations, but they can't ban them. And to us is a key piece. We don't think only progressive parts of the state need psychedelic healing. All parts of Colorado definitely need psychedelic healing. And there's a limitation on, you can't have like an interest in more than 5 healing centers. We'll see how this plays out. This could effectively prohibit public companies from being in the space, because public companies can't control who owns their shares. And so then it's like you could have an individual, if you as an individual could own 1 share of 20 different public companies, and how would the state regulate like having an individual interest? And so we'll see how that regulation unfolds.
And with hope that would fight against monopolizing markets and industries like we see in cannabis. Like in Illinois, it's the top 4 or 5 players who control 80% of that regulated market as far as like recreational cannabis. And so obviously there's the idealism with where we're at now, and then the implementation on how that looks moving forward. What else is important to share around the licensure and regulations around healing centers?
Yeah, I think the biggest what I wanted to get to was sort of like where we landed on, on corporate influence. And so, we debated for a while, it's like, should we require these companies to be nonprofits or require them to be benefit corps? And that didn't make sense to us, because people just they'll hire attorneys like me and we'll create paths around it. And it actually kind of like dilutes the benefit corp name if you mandate that people are that. And so where we landed was like, hey, you know what? Let's like take a step deeper, and not just like hate capitalism for the sake of hating capitalism, but like, what do we hate about capitalism? And so like when we took that step deeper, we're like, hey, maybe we can mandate certain business practices in this space, and we can only let companies in this space who have business practices that match like our values as a community. And so what we built in is this environmental social governance screen, or this ESG screen, that needs to be created, that would rank, if you wanted to get a healing center license, you'll need to go through this ESG screen and say, and you'll be ranked on, hey, how much do you pay your employees? What sort of benefits do you provide? What are your environmental standards? Are you net positive, from an energy use? Do you have sustainable agricultural practices? Do you have a transparent, do you have a transparent board? And what I want to build in there, then it's not really built into a lot of ESG screens, but like, do you have some sort of benefit honoring program? Are you giving back to these like intergenerational traditions and tribes that have kept this medicine sacred? What's being tasked is like, is to create this business practices screen around ESG principles that relate to, the purpose of this. And then only if a company scores so high can they even participate. And so it sort of sets, unlike cannabis, where it's like the race to the bottom, how cheap can we make this? Like, we're saying, well, you can still race to the bottom, but the bottom is going to be substantially better than all the other industries around. And so, I'm super excited about this measure. And I think the effectiveness, to sort of riff off what you said earlier, Jimmy, it's like the effectiveness of this screen will really relate to like what implementation looks like. It could be meaningless, or it could be very meaningful. And so, to me, this is like a key piece that's like different than Oregon, because there's no screen like this in Oregon. Frankly, it's almost different than any other industry that's out there.
Well, and it's also interesting because I think about, when you talk about one of the ranking factors being how you take care of your employees or don't in some cases. And, these facilitator training programs in Oregon cost, anywhere from 10 to 20K, and then there's no indication of what facilitators will get paid and if they'll ever be able to like make their money back. And there's certain things like this that just there's a lot of uncertainty around.
Right. And I actually think that's like one key thing too, is I think facilitators are just like, they're not tied to the healing centers. So it's like facilitators themselves have their own agency, where it's like what we saw in cannabis, which is a real problem, was like you'd have like early cannabis, all the growers had to work for a dispensary. It was like forced vertical integration. Facilitators don't. Like they'll be able to go to people's houses, they'll be able to go to nursing homes, they'll be able to organize collectively amongst themselves. So I think we'll see some very like facilitator forward healing center models, here in Colorado that are, more of like a place for facilitators to operate.
Yeah, that's cool. And that's important. And anyone that's listened to our show for any period of time recognizes that, who you choose as a facilitator is a really big deal. And it is important that, there's consideration given to who it is that's supporting you on your journey.
And now that there are regulatory frameworks around licensure, what Nick said still holds true. Like just because somebody does have a facilitator 1 or facilitator 2, facilitator 3 license around this doesn't mean that they are the right facilitator for you. Doesn't mean that they are going to operate in the highest, ethics and integrity, because this is a very, very new landscape that people are excited about. And that has its pros and cons, as well. So I know we're getting close to time, Josh. So just like our last episode, I want to make sure that you have time to cover all of the things important, pieces that you want around this regulatory, side. So just feel free to share what you'd like with our audience.
Yeah, no, I think a big piece is, there's this mandate, for regulations around like an equitable program. And the mandate, says it's like, that this, that the advisory board and the and DORA are supposed to establish policies and procedures to ensure that, that this program is equitable and inclusive, to promote both like the licensing and like the provision of natural medicine services to a couple of different communities that have been disproportionately harmed by high rates of arrest, to people who face, barriers to access healthcare, to folks who have a traditional or indigenous history of natural medicines, or to veterans. And I think this is like key, because it's like that is the mandate from the very beginning. And then it's like, what do these policies like look like? They're supposed to be around reduced fees for licensure and facilitator training. They're supposed to be, incentivizing the provision of these natural medicine services at reduced cost to low income individuals, incentivizing geographical and cultural diversity in licensing and the availability of these services, and then also a built-in program to review the effectiveness of this whole equity program. And I think, and the equity program is allowed to be funded, by the licensing fees, of these healing centers. So, I think, again, this is one of those, like, we put in this, like, what could be, a beautiful house, depending on how it's created, through this regulatory process, or it could be something meaningless. And so it's like, how do we, the big takeaway, I think, on this one and many pieces is like, hey, we need to like make sure this regulatory program turns out how we want it to turn out, and that like, that the limitations on the corporatization of this, our equity program, a meaningful facilitator training program, like are actually like effective and based off of like the best knowledge we have as a community, even though understanding like we're gonna make mistakes and it's not gonna be perfect, and it's gonna be, and it's making regulations is, it's not the prettiest process, because there's different stakeholders and people are going to argue over like what their priorities are.
Yeah, ultimately my takeaway from your share there is that though the passing of Prop 122 was a really big milestone in I think Colorado's history and the history of the United States, the real work is actually starting, because this is where the rubber hits the road as far as implementation and governance and who the regulators are. Like, I even saw that with cannabis, right? Like when there were rules around metric and regulating the supply chain, you were basically having to account for every single gram of cannabis that you produce. Imagine if Budweiser had to track every single bottle of alcohol that they had to produce. And there was a big gap in, I think, what the regulation said that you have to do versus what was actually tracked and enforceable within metric and within the regulatory, stuff. Metric was the seed to sale system in Colorado that like tracked all of that. So it's just an example that though these provisions are and mandates are written in now, there's a lot of work moving forward as far as how this looks in actuality.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I've been using the analogy that, election night when it passed was, sort of, the false summit.
Yeah.
Like we all thought we made it to the top of the mountain, and when we finally got there, we realized that, the actual mountain's like right in front of us, and and we're just like at a spot we can make a base camp.
Yeah. So where can people find more information, Josh? I'm sure that you'll have some resources on the Vicente Sederberg site, or for folks both on the personal use side and both on the regulatory licensure side who are interested in following this and keeping up to date. Do you have any, outlets for those folks?
Yeah, there's a couple. So, one is, at Vicente Sederberg, we work with, all sorts of different, facilitators or potential facilitators, or people trying to figure out what their rights are under this. And you can always reach out to us. We do have a lot of information on our website. We have a summary of the law. There'll be, we'll see. I'm sure we'll post some updates about what's happening during the implementation process. And there's also, there's, a lot of community groups that are, I expect we'll have good information out there, whether it's, from like, NOAC Society or SPORE or, the Healing Advocacy Fund. There's a lot of different groups that are still trying, that are, putting out some good information on this. And, I think we'll see more, and I think, and one piece too is there's a big mandated public education component of this too, which maybe I'll just say for another episode.
Yeah, I mean, that's such a big focus for Nick and I, is how do we get folks actionable, tangible information on how to move forward in a safe manner that also helps you to move closer to your intentions. And so we'll likely work on some things as well on getting some of this information out to the public in a meaningful and educational way. So well, thank you. Go ahead, Nick.
I just wanted to say thank you for the intentionality and the thoughtfulness that you and your team put into drafting this, because, just from our discussion today, it definitely comes through. And so my hope is that the implementation matches the intentionality with which all this was written.
I appreciate that. And that is my hope too. And, and I think, we'll need to make changes. Like things will real, as, we sort of like, pave new roads here, like we'll realize like, some things were wrong, and like, and I think through this process, hopefully it's like we can all come together and with humility and fix those things.
Yeah. Building the plane as it flies, which is seemingly one of the ways of paving a path forward in the psychedelic world that we're living in. So
right.
Yeah. So thank you so much, Josh. That wraps up our episode this week. So thank you to all of our listeners. You can download episodes of the Psychedelic Passage podcast by looking for all of our episodes in cannabisradio.com, Apple Podcasts, Amazon, Spotify, iHeartRadio, wherever you get podcasts. We really appreciate the community engagement. We are just so humbled and grateful that we do have you all listening to our episodes and that you're getting some type of value from there. So let us know how we can, continue to provide that value and support in future episodes. You can give us a rating, you can give us a review, you can send us a message. and we look forward to seeing you all next time.
The opinions expressed on this CannabisRadio.com program are those of the guests and hosts and do not necessarily reflect those of the staff and management of CannabisRadio.com. Any rebroadcast, republication, or retransmission of this program without proper consent is prohibited.